Fair warning, if you're watching this video because you have an exam coming up in 48 hours or less, you're watching the wrong video. So I'll actually link to a video that I already made about how to cram somewhere on the screen or down in the description below. Now, if this isn't a video about how to cram for an exam, what exactly is it? Well, this is about how to study, how to actually learn the material that you are learning in class. And so if you're going to learn how to study, then I have to take for granted that you already know two things. One, you know how to prep for a lecture, and you know how to actually get the most out of the lectures that you're attending. Again, those are videos that I've made that I'll link down below, but that is way too much preamble. So before I get lost in too much more, let's talk about how to do studying correctly. Now, the first thing to understand when you're studying is it is really helpful to have a good grasp about the differences between studying and cramming, because most students, frankly, are used to just cramming. They wait until a few days before a final exam or a midterm or a quiz, and they try and ram as much information into their head as possible. I'm not going to lie, that's what I did throughout most of my academic career, and it does work to some extent to get you through school, but it is stressful. You don't actually learn a whole lot, and you definitely don't retain much in the long term. So rather than cramming, what we're really focusing on here is studying. And the big difference between studying and cramming is that in cramming, you're really just trying to memorize stuff for a short-term purpose. Whereas when you study something, you're trying to learn something. You're trying to understand the underlying material. And that is something that should, in theory, stick with you for a lot longer. So if you want to get more out of the courses that you're taking, really what you should be doing is studying. And if you have done the pre-work going into lectures, and you've attended lectures, and you have paid attention, and you've used my notes or my videos about how to take notes properly, then you're really well set up to study. And at this point, studying should really just be a question of reviewing, and it's actually pretty simple. So now the other thing we need to understand about studying is really the act of practicing recall. Most learning can be broken down into two stages. I'm simplifying, but basically, you can break learning into two stages. The first is encoding, where you take information that you are just learning and you store it somewhere in your brain. And the second is recall, where you go back to get that information and pull it to the forefront to be able to use it. So studying is really, what studying should really be is, it shouldn't be about encoding information into your brain. That part should already be done as you are taking notes or as you are going through textbooks or as you're attending lectures. Studying should really be all about practicing that recall. So when you need that information in the future, it's easy for you to go get it, and you can just pick it up really, really quickly. So what we're going to talk about for the rest of this video is a few different techniques to practice your recall. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to practice your recall skills. In this video, I'm going to go through about 6 of them, and I'm going to go through them in order of sort of my least favorite to my favorite. And also, if they're my least favorite to my favorite, it's probably because they're also the least effective to the most effective, at least for me. That being said, I'm putting them all out there because all of them are valid ways of learning, and it's really just a question of what works best for you. Starting with the first method, which again, my least favorite, is spaced repetition. The idea behind spaced repetition is, once you have learned something, once you've encoded it through taking notes, attending lectures, you make yourself recall that information on a regular basis. So essentially, this is the idea of, if you were trying to memorize something, for example, it would be the idea of repeating something to yourself over and over and over again. And what makes this different than just plain repetition is that you space this out into longer and longer chunks. So at the beginning, when you're first learning something, the amount of space you take in between different sessions is going to be shorter. So you might repeat something over and over and over again at the beginning, and then space things out by half an hour, wait another day, do it again, then you wait 3 days, do it again, wait another week, do it again. And what this spaced repetition does is allows your brain to practice going to get that information. Because if you don't do this spaced repetition, what will happen is you end up falling on what's known as the forgetting curve. So information that you remember over time, if you don't access it, you will slowly begin to forget it. I'm not going to get into forgetting curve too much because it's beyond the scope of this video, but spaced repetition is probably the most common study tactic. And if you've never been taught how to study, it's probably the way that you're actually doing most of your studying now. The second technique I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a variation on spaced repetition, and that's the use of flashcards. So the idea behind flashcards is you would have a physical piece of paper at least in the traditional sense. And on one side of the paper or the index card, you would write the concept or the term that you were trying to learn about. And on the other side of the card, you would write out the definition or the explanation or the application of that concept. And the idea is obviously you put all these flashcards together and you quiz yourself by pulling out a flashcard, looking at the term on the front, trying to remember what's on the back before actually turning it around and looking at it so that you can figure out whether or not this is actually, you're actually correct in doing this. This is not my favorite way of practicing recall, mainly because it just takes a lot of time. There's a lot of effort required in creating flashcards, and then you need to redo them over and over and over again. So there's a lot of effort required in actually maintaining the practice. There's some electronic tools out there that I know can make the process a little bit simpler, but regardless, there is just quite a bit of effort involved in this. And I do think there's more efficient and probably more effective ways of learning. But if flashcards are something that work for you, it is a tried, tested, and true method that has worked for many, many people for a really long time. The third way you can study, and now we're starting to get into some of my favorite ways of learning, is a little bit more active and it's a little bit more engaging, because really it tries to take what you're learning and use it in a much more real world application style setting. And what I'm talking about here essentially is doing practice questions. So regardless of the type of course that you're taking, you probably have some way of getting access to practice questions. If you've got a textbook, there's tons of practice questions that are going to be baked into that textbook. Maybe your professor has given you practice questions and assignments. You can look for past year exams. There are a ton of resources online now that put up previous year's exams online, so you can go and you can check out what's been done by even your specific professor in previous years. Makes a professor's job a lot harder because it means we actually need to create brand new exams every single year, because students who are looking up past year exams might have the exact questions we are going to use if we were just going to repeat the same exam. But that's not your problem. If you're taking the course, definitely use these resources. There's nothing wrong with it. It is not cheating. It is just incumbent on your professors to put in a little bit more work to make sure that the exams are different and more challenging. But the past year exams are also a great idea for you to check out, because it gives you a sense of the types of questions that your specific professor would have created in the past. And so they're likely going to be something similar in the current year. And you might even luck out and you might get a lazy professor who just reuses the same exams, in which case you will have basically gotten a cheat sheet for the entire exam. But practice questions are fantastic ways of studying, because it's not just a question of repeating something over and over again to make sure you kind of flatten out that forgetting curve. It's actually a question of practicing that recall and creating new connections between different concepts, because the question is going to force you to think about the material in a different way. It's not just going to be straight regurgitation. It's actually going to be understanding, and understanding is really at the root of learning. So if you can understand it, then it'll be that much easier for you to remember, and you'll perform better on the exams and you'll retain the information for a lot longer. The fourth technique is a little bit more advanced, but it's also a little bit more creative, and so it's a little bit more fun. And the idea here is you will create your own practice questions. So the fun part about creating your own practice questions is you engage the creative part of your brain, and it forces you to think a little bit like your professor and like the person who would be creating an exam, which again will force your brain to think on the material in a slightly different fashion. It's like the Jeopardy question style, where instead of giving the answer, you have to think of what the question is. It forces your brain to work a little bit differently, and it looks at the material from a different angle, which helps you really sort of build those connections between different concepts, and again, really crystallizes that overall structure of information that you have stored in your brain. And it makes it that much easier for you to recall it later, because now you've got different ways of accessing it. There's not just one path for you to get to that information. You've got a bunch of different entryways. So creating your own practice questions are a really great idea. You can't really do this though if you haven't practiced other questions first, because you won't know what types of questions to create. But I personally think that creating practice questions is probably one of the best ways of studying, and it's definitely one of the more fun and more efficient ways of doing it, because you're not just consistently repeating a bunch of stuff over and over again. The next technique I'm going to talk about is one that has gotten really popular over the last few years, and that is something called the Feynman technique, named after Richard Feynman, who was a physics professor, very well-known physics professor, who is known to be just a really great teacher. Professor Feynman created this technique, or I don't know if he created it, but he at least popularized it. And the idea behind the Feynman technique really stems from one of his philosophies, which was if you want to understand a concept, you should be able to teach it to someone else. And not only does that mean that you have fully grasped the material, because if you can explain it to someone, that means you understand it. And when we say explain it, it's not just, repeat verbatim what you read out of a textbook. The idea behind the Feynman technique is you should be able to simplify what you've learned so that you can explain it to a layperson being someone who doesn't have the expertise that you do. Some people say you should be able to explain it at something like a 5th grade level. The actual level doesn't really matter. The whole point here is take the material and recreate it and reteach it to another person that doesn't have any expertise in the area. So this is a really, really effective study technique, and it's also a really great technique for lifelong learning. The Feynman technique is essentially what a lot of people will be doing as they kind of go beyond school and try to learn new skills. They will kind of learn in public. So anyone who has kind of a blog or a YouTube channel where they're educating people about things, in a lot of ways what they're doing is really they're learning as they go, because as you teach someone, you become a better student yourself. So the Feynman technique has been proven to be a really great way of learning stuff, and it's also just a lot more fun than just, again, mindlessly repeating the same thing over and over again. And the last technique I'll mention isn't really a technique per se. It's more of a way that you can go about studying that makes it more interesting and will force you to kind of stay focused, and that is to study with a friend. That doesn't mean you and a friend get together in the library and you sit next to each other and you both read from the textbook. No, it means that you interact with the other person, you ask each other questions, you dig deeper into things that you don't understand. You can do this really, really well with a lot of the previous techniques that I just talked about. So if, for example, you're using the Feynman technique, you can put together sort of a view of the material, and then you can teach a friend what you have learned about a certain section of the course. And then that friend can listen to what you have to say, and they can ask questions about things that aren't clear, and that'll force you to find the gaps in your own knowledge, because it is one thing to think that you know the material, but when you have someone else listening to what you have to say and poking holes in your explanations, that's when you start to know whether or not you've really understood it. So working with a friend can be really helpful. Same thing with doing practice questions. It just makes it that much more engaging, that much more fun when you're not just, sitting in front of a mirror and reading questions to yourself. You've got someone else to bounce things off of. Also, if the other person is really motivated, it keeps you accountable. It means you're not going to stop studying after 15 minutes and scroll through your social media feed. It kind of forces you to stay on topic. So study with a friend. That is a tip that can apply across any of the other techniques, and it is super, super useful, and it is something that I don't know why more people don't do. I've definitely seen a lot of students join study groups, and then when I ask what they do in a study group, basically everyone just sort of studies quietly in the same space, which on the one hand helps with accountability, on the other hand doesn't actually help you with the other part, which is, testing each other's knowledge and pushing each other to the limit. Which is a really great segue into how not to study. So there's a few things that you should definitely not do when you're studying, and those are things like just rereading your notes, rewatching lectures that were pre-recorded, just reading a textbook, reviewing someone else's notes. All of these things, which I think a lot of people confuse for studying, are actually by far the worst possible ways to study, because when you're doing these things, most of them are being done passively. And our brain doesn't work and it doesn't learn passively. Learning is an active activity, so you actually have to engage in some sort of effort in order to learn. When you're just reading something off of a page or watching a lecture, even if you've watched it 15 times in a row, your brain is just sort of passively consuming content, which is why you might remember it for a little while, but eventually you're going to forget that really, really quickly because you haven't really stored that information in your brain. It's just kind of in your short-term memory. Whereas doing any of the other study techniques I talked about really forces you to kind of write that deeper into your brain, and it allows you to practice going back to get that information. The other reason all these other passive study techniques don't work is because they're not actually getting you to practice recall. So whereas doing practice questions and teaching someone a material and working with a friend, all of these things are forcing you to practice the recall aspect of learning. just passively consuming something does not practice recall at all. So the first time you're actually going to engage your recall is when you sit down for your midterm, your final exam, or wherever you actually need the material. And if that's the first time you're practicing your recall, then there's a very good chance that you are just going to not be able to find what you're looking for. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to drop something somewhere in a giant scrap heap and then hope that when I come back to it in a month, I'll remember where I left it. Unless you keep going back to the place and it's all organized well and you understand how things connect together, you're never going to find what you're looking for. So all of these sort of passive study techniques, which is the way that I know a lot of students have studied for most of their academic careers, they're really not that effective. You can brute force your way through them and just kind of keep rereading, keep redoing stuff. But the reality is they're never going to be as effective. They're never going to be as efficient. And also they're just boring. So throw all those out the window. Really take the time to engage with your lectures, take good notes. The notes are not going to be the things that you review, but they're going to help you encode the information, and then practice. Practice with questions, practice with friends, practice teaching stuff. That is the way that you're actually going to learn. That's the way you're actually going to study. Is it going to feel harder? Yes, absolutely. But that's kind of the point. If it doesn't feel harder, you're not actually learning anything. It's kind of like going to the gym. If you go to the gym and you lift 2-pound weights, you're never going to get any stronger because you're not putting your muscles under any kind of strain. Well, the same goes for your brain. If you just kind of sit there and passively watch a lecture and don't take notes and don't think about it and don't try and connect the concepts, your brain's not working, so you're not going to be exercising your brain at all. So think of studying like going to the gym. You need to put some sort of effort in, otherwise you're not actually going to be getting any kind of results. So really, that's it. That's how you study. It's not rocket science, but it does require a little bit more effort than most people are used to putting in. But that effort will be rewarded because it'll take less time, it'll be less stressful, and you'll actually be able to retain that information for a lot longer. Now that you know how to study, maybe your question is, okay, now, but where do I find the time to do this? I'm always waiting until the last minute. Well, I've created a video or two about how to manage your time more effectively, so maybe go check one of those out. And until next time, cheers.